the chat.
Okay, and can they see me?
Hey everyone, we are here with Kyle, who is the co-founder of BZX. He'll be doing a talk on the current and future directions of liquidity mining for lending and exchange AMMs. Once he starts talking, can you guys confirm in the chat that you can hear him?
Hello?
Kyle, you can start talking. There's a slight lag between when they confirm and when you start talking.
Okay, sure. Hi, I'm Kyle Kistner, co-founder of BZX, margin lending and trading protocol on the Ethereum blockchain. Today I'll be talking a little bit about liquidity mining for both lending and exchange AMMs. I'll just pause to confirm that everybody can hear me. Am I on video? Am I seen right now, or is it only the presentation?
You're on video. You're on the bottom left, and the presentation's up. Everything's clear.
Okay. So I can start, or?
You can start.
Okay, great. All right, so just a quick primer, even though I'm sure almost everybody is aware by now, the craze has come and to some extent gone. What is liquidity mining? So it's the distribution of protocol equity to liquidity providers as a mechanism to attract more liquidity providers. So this was first pioneered by Synthetics, but later kind of popularized and perfected by Compound, who built it into the protocol level, and it was quickly followed by many others after them. So there's some liquidity mining programs I'm going to be talking about and touching on a bit. In the lending category, there's Compound, there's us, BZX, and there's Cream. In the AMM category, that's Balancer, Uniswap, Cream Swap and Creamy, and Curve. Now, there's different approaches that each of these have. So Cream and BZX had a liquidity mining program that was sort of medium term. It wasn't long term like Compound's 4-year program. So far, BZX's program has run for a little bit over a month. Cream has ran for a few months. Balancer, Uniswap, they both have longer term liquidity mining programs. Cream Swap and Creamy had a very, very short-lived liquidity mining program, and I think it's especially interesting because they quickly injected the rewards and quickly pulled them out. And then lastly is Curve, which had a very long-term emission schedule, and they also released retrospective rewards that were vested. So among those that gave out vested rewards, you only really have BZX and then the people in Curve with the retrospective rewards that were vested. It is a small sample size to kind of compare the two, but we are wondering, what are the different approaches? Doing it for a long time, doing it with vested, giving it to people retrospectively, what works best? So a little bit about Complementals 101, as it's sort of commonly understood in the ecosystem. So liquidity mining is thought to have a sort of virtuous cycle built into it. You release the tokens, that subsidizes activity on the protocol. People come and take up that subsidy. That creates more value on the protocol, which creates more cash flows on the protocol, which attracts more demand for the tokens because there's thought to be more cash flows because there's more TVL. And conversely, on the way down, there's a vicious cycle where the subsidy continuously goes down in value, which causes less total value lock, which causes less cash flows, which causes less demand for the token, and so on. Now, I think that this is definitely a commonly accepted model, but we should also question it to some extent. I think there are some problems with our understanding of this model, and understanding those problems will help us move forward in making our liquidity mining programs better and less wasteful. So A little bit about the network effects of total value lock. You have AMMs and you have lending and you have slippage on both of them, but the slippage is very different. The consequences for traders and borrowers, like the consequences for slippage for them are very, very different when you're using an AMM versus when you're using a lending protocol. So when you do liquidity mining on both of them, on both AMMs and lending protocols, you're building up liquidity and you're lowering slippage in some sense. So that sense is for AMMs is the spread, right? And it lowers the spread, sorry, not the spread, the depth. It increases the depth, which gives you better prices for larger orders. And this penalty that you pay for larger orders happens immediately and sort of irrevocably on the exchange side. Whereas on the lending side, you have interest rate slippage, which is quite different. So with interest rate slippage, if you're a borrower and you borrow a large quantity of funds, you may temporarily spike up the interest rates. And for that short amount of time, you will be paying, and you, along with all the other borrowers, will be paying a higher interest rate. But with a lending protocol, you also attract lenders with that increased borrowing rate that translates into a higher supply rate, which translates into more lending liquidity coming, which pushes back down the rates. So lending rates tend to equilibrate across the ecosystem. When you reduce the slippage for interest rates, it's actually a pretty small effect in the scheme of things. So when you get more liquidity on an AMM, what you get is every single trader is benefiting from that. No matter who you are, the smallest trader to the largest trader, you're going to get a better rate. Whereas with lending protocols, you're enabling people to do large borrows and large refinances, but really you're only improving the functionality for basically the largest users. So if you looked back, a while back, and you looked at the largest MakerDAO CDPs, you'd see that the one of the top ones generated maybe 7 million DAI, but then more commonly 3.5, a few million DAI here and there. So in order to adequately service borrowers like this, really you only need to have a few million in free liquidity. If you have 10 million in free DAI liquidity, you're very able to handle these kind of customers. So with lending protocols, once you reach a certain point, the increased liquidity really starts having diminishing returns. Whereas with AMMs, every time you increase that liquidity, you're getting more network effects, you're overcoming the network effects of others, you're attracting more traders, and it's an unstoppable snowball. So there's these two very different kind of versions of liquidity mining that people don't really touch on that much. So a little bit about tokenomics and price now. So there's a lot of different approaches to the tokenomics. There's releasing it right away, it's vested, there's slowly. But what we actually see if we chart all of the prices of the different yield farming tokens, this is a logarithmic chart, by the way, what we actually see is that the price action is very similar. It's not all just a bunch of crisscross lines. It's a lot of lines that very much cluster together. You see that basically macro trends have dominated the price action of the various DeFi and yield farming tokens since they've been out. And it's very difficult to really analyze the differential effects of these different tokenomics models as they're really operating at the margins. So now that we've seen the price action, we might wonder, okay, do vesting tokens actually matter? So there's basically three different ways you can go about distributing these tokens. The first way is to just release them in a perfectly liquid state. The next way is to put the token in a vesting contract, tokenize the vesting contract, and distribute those tokens. And the third way is to simply create a vesting contract and have people be vested in a non-tokenized way. This can be gotten around, but it requires some degree of coordination from the different people who are vested. So these all have different trade-offs in terms of liquidity, whereas obviously a token by itself is the most liquid. A vesting token is somewhere in between the two, and a fully vested token is basically completely illiquid with the exception of using legal instruments like contracts. From a blockchain perspective, it's illiquid and uncomposable, whereas vesting tokens are quite composable in contrast. So there was a lot of speculation in the ecosystem, a lot of chatter that said, okay, Compound, Balancer, Curve, all of these farming tokens with unvested rewards are going to continuously bleed. They're going to put continuous downward pressure on the price. So what we actually see in practice, though, with most of these programs is that, again, macro factors have dominated inflationary pressures over medium time span. So over the course of a few months, the inflation is really, having, maybe 10, 20% effect on the price, but the actual markets themselves are moving quite a bit more wildly than that. So what we see is like BZX, for example, had a vesting token. We didn't see the price action of the token differ a lot from others like Cream that gave out many unvested tokens. And so as a basis of comparison, at very least, there's not an immediate and a strong impact that you can pick out, but that doesn't mean that over longer time periods, we can't start to see some effects of having vesting farming rewards versus unvested farming rewards. So there's some trade-offs to vesting, and the biggest one is when you vest when you put the vesting tokens in the vesting contract, you will tend to get less liquidity in the protocol. But on the plus side, you're also not going to have people able to dump the token right away, which does hurt the positive, the virtuous cycle to some extent. So you get the delayed negative impacts, you get more liquidity, but on the flip side of that, you also get more cash flows when you attract more liquidity, and that could offset the negative impact of inflation on the price action. As we mentioned, the inflation, especially in medium terms, seems to be not very large. So it's very possible you could imagine that there's factors offsetting this, which are making it difficult to pick out. So the biggest thing I would say with tokenized vesting is that to really understand tokenized vesting, it's fungible to those with a time horizon equal to the vesting period. So to a certain extent, vesting tokens are going to absorb demand from the regular unvested protocol token. And to the extent that it does that, it's going to put negative pressure on the price, but it's not going to be quite as much negative pressure per token emitted as if you gave them the completely unvested token. So another angle to consider about liquidity mining, which is sort of under discussed, is the liquidity mining is ICO. So despite having similar total value locked, Aave and Compound generate very different revenue numbers. Aave has quite a lot of locked value, quite a lot of borrowing activity, but Compound actually dwarfs it in terms of the revenue that it's driving right now. So you can kind of envision this as liquidity miners are paying protocol fees on these protocols, and those protocol fees go It goes to the protocol, to the token holders, but in a very in a way, you could look at this as a sort of distributed ICO. So now instead of just like the central team selling the token in exchange for money, it's all token holders selling the token in exchange for protocol fees. So that's one way to look at it, and one way you could kind of explain to yourself why liquidity mining protocols are driving so much cash flows. So a little bit about our approach. We had vested tokens. We gave it to only borrowers. So that's something really different about our program compared to the other lending protocols, which gave equal amounts to both lenders and borrowers. So we ended up attracting a significant amount of liquidity, about 25 million at our peak. One thing we did notice as a downside to our program is that the borrowing rates had to be very high as a result, because borrowers were willing to pay a very high price in exchange for the high yields. This wasn't a problem that only we had. Other people also experienced this problem, Compound notably. This was written about by some VCs, such as Hash, distortions in the borrowing rate pushing away organic users. So this is something that lending protocols really do need to figure out how to solve, how to incentivize the borrowers and lenders without interfering with the market rates and chasing away the most important organic customers. So also a little bit about questioning assumptions. So back here we talked about liquidity mining on the way up and liquidity mining on the way down. And a lot of people accept this, but it might not be completely accurate. And so let's talk about why. So some questions. Why haven't the total value locked of DeFi protocols dropped in proportion to the price? Some of these protocols have had token drops of 70 to 90%. That's a huge drop in the subsidy. And yet we don't see a proportional drop in the total value locked. So it could be that there's something else going on here. The right-hand side of that image, that loop doesn't seem to have been borne out very well. Another example is Creamy, the stablecoin AMM. As of today, it's at $8 million total value locked, despite the fact that it only introduced a few weeks of liquidity mining rewards and withdrew them almost right away. The subsidy is at 0, yet the total value locked is at 8 million. It seems that there was quite a bit of success in subsidizing Creamy in a very brief and concentrated manner. Other evidence, our protocol, BZX, we cut the farming rewards in half, and we experienced only a very small decrease in total value locked. So the general idea here is that the market is efficient. You can't trick the market by subsidizing activity and making the market think that this is going to represent lots of cash flows in the future. That's essentially what's wrong with this conceptualization of yield farming. The market understands that this is a temporary thing, but it also understands that there is exposure, there is increased users, there is something there. And when you conceptualize it as being a marketing device which trains users and exposes users to the product and thereby increases future cash flows in this way, then the price action and the total value lock numbers that we're seeing actually make a lot more sense. So where could liquidity mining be going in the future? Based on what I'm seeing, based on looking at all these different programs, the takeaway is that liquidity mining is an explosive burst of marketing at the very beginning, and the positive effects of it seem to taper off very quickly. So in light of that, I think one trend we could start to see as people start to realize this is that distribution times become much shorter for liquidity mining programs. Another thing I think we could see is vertically integrated liquidity mining. We first saw something like this with Cream, where they offered Creamy and Cream Swap, and they offered Cream tokens to those the LPs for those protocols. We can definitely see a lot more different permutations of this. One could easily imagine if Creamy had instead its own token with its own tokenomics, or Cream Swap, etc. So there's a lot of possibilities for vertically integrating liquidity mining protocols, composing liquidity mining with themselves. That's the important thing here. Vesting, I think, as one of the protocols that pioneered the vesting approach, it has an uncertain future. The results of using vesting as opposed to unvested tokens are still unproven and will need to prove themselves over a longer period of time. And then lastly, and I think this is obvious for everyone, the last thing that needs to happen with liquidity mining is cash flows. It's going to become a critical part of relieving the sell pressure that is associated with these emissions. So that is my presentation. At this point, I'll be happy to take questions from anyone in the audience.
Cool. So if you guys have questions, just drop in the chat, or you can drop it in the Ask a Question tab at the bottom. And Kyle, if there are any common questions that you normally get, just feel free to go over it, because I'm sure like with every single project, people ask you a lot of the same things very often. So it would be like an opportunity to get that, to never have to answer those again.
Okay. Common questions.
Yeah, maybe common misconceptions would probably be a good place to start.
Okay.
What do people usually ask you about your project that's absolutely wrong?
Just about the project in general, or about like liquidity mining?
Well, your project and liquidity mining.
What do people? I guess like the biggest misconception that we came across was concerning the fungibility of vesting tokens with unvested tokens. So like this whole concept of tokenized vesting. It's like, okay, well, if the token is in a vesting contract, but then I have a token representing that, isn't it basically the same thing? And so
So like a derivative of a token that is vesting.
Yeah, exactly. And so this really and in fact, actually, we came up with the idea, but it probably took us like a good week and a half to kind of work out what the answer was to that in a way that satisfied us. So yeah, it's very mind bending because there aren't a lot of examples of other instruments like that in the ecosystem, and so.
I think like a similar thing to that would be like staking derivatives, but that's more on the layer one side than it is on the application layer. But it's kind of similar in that sense, in that there's an underlying token and then underlying token that's locked and then a representation of it.
Yeah, it's similar. And so, people didn't understand like what it should be, that like how to value it, I think in particular.
So how do you guys value it?
So the way we look at it is okay, well, I will say that we do think it is difficult to value, like in terms of it is difficult to value, but the way that we look at it is basically it's the time value of money, and the future prospects of the token is being built in to the price. As well as the expectations of future emissions. But like the big thing that I think the number one thing here is that people had a hard time understanding whether or not having these tokenized vesting, these vesting tokens actually in practice added to the circulating token supply. They were like, is this, so we're like, we locked up, like 88% of our tokens, and then we put it in this vesting contract. And they're like, well, did you actually somehow, like, is it what you did equivalent to getting it out? Is it basically like the token supply is 1 billion now instead of 140 million? And so kind of like working through that, and the extent, the answer is that like it effectively does increase the token supply, but only to the extent that people find the two tokens to be fungible. And that's only to the extent that people have a very long time horizon, like a 4-year time horizon. So it does, but only a little bit. So that's why that intuition was there. And we had to kind of explain that intuition to people that they had, that like we were increasing the token supply, because we kind of were, but kind of weren't. Okay. Somebody asks, how deep does the pool go and how do we track it? Which pool? Right now we have several million in our very stablecoin pools, about 5 million in USDC. How much leverage and deleveraging is needed to measure? Don't understand that question. If you expand on it, I'd be happy to answer. All right. If there's anything else, be happy to.
Cool. Normally I would offer questions, but I'm kind of exhausted, so I can't really think straight. So if anyone else has additional questions, just feel free to drop in the chat, or you can ping him directly on Twitter. And yeah.
And can stop by our Telegram or Discord. We have a very friendly community and always happy to answer questions and just talk.
Perfect. Kyle, do you have any last words?
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for sponsoring. Ooh, a question.
How is this decentralized? We're basically just like all the other lending protocols. We, non-custodial smart contracts. There is an admin key. It's getting phased out to a DAO over the next quarter or so. Where does the value come from? Trading fees, origination fees, fees paid on interest. Is basically what it is. Same place the value comes from for a stock. It's cash flows. Stocks come out of thin air as well. All right.
Cool. Okay. Well, this is a wrap. Thanks so much for taking the time, and appreciate the sponsorship for the event.
Thanks so much for having me. Y'all have a good one.
Yep. All right. Take care. Bye.